Chapter 2. A brief critique of the evolutionary model. Editor's note. This chapter has been transcribed from a taped lecture that Father Seraphim gave during his Orthodox Survival course in the summer of 1975. The section titles and some additions to the text have been taken from his written outline of the course. Additions have also been taken from previous lectures in the same course, which provide necessary background to the present discussion. 1. Introduction. Now we come to a key concept which is extremely important for understanding both the religious and the secular outlook of contemporary man. This idea is an extremely complex one, and here we can give only a sketchy outline of the problems involved in this question. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species came out in 1859, was instantly accepted by many people and soon became very popular. People such as T.H. Huxley and Herbert Spencer in England, together with Ernst Haeckel in Germany, author of The Riddle of the Universe, 1899, and others popularized the ideas of Darwin and made evolution the very center of their philosophy. It seems to explain everything. Of course, people like Nietzsche picked it up and used it for their so-called spiritual prophecies. Thus, the people who were in the main school of Western thought, which was rationalism carried as far as you can take it, accepted evolution. To the present day, one can say that evolution is a central dogma of advanced thinkers, of people who are in harmony with the times. From the very beginning, however, there were people who were arguing about this. In the time of Darwin, there was a Catholic thinker, George Jackson Mivart, author of On the Genesis of Species, 1871, who believed in evolution but not in Darwin's idea of natural selection, which reduced Darwin to despair because the latter discovered that his idea could not be proved. Especially in the last 10 to 30 years, there have come out many critical accounts of evolution from an objective point of view. As these works demonstrate, most of the books supporting evolution begin with certain premises and assumptions arising from the naturalistic outlook. Now, there is even a society in San Diego called the Institute for Creation Research, which has come out with several good books. They themselves are religious, but they have several books which discuss evolution quite objectively, not at all from a religious standpoint. They say there are two models for understanding the universe. One is the evolution model, and another is the creation model. They take the evidence of the history of the earth, for example, the geological layers and so forth, and they try to see which model it fits. They have discovered that fewer adjustments have to be made if one follows the model of creation. If there was a God who created things in the beginning, and if the earth is not billions of years old, but only some thousands of years old. The evolutionary model, on the other hand, requires a good many corrections. In this regard, it can be compared to the old model of the Ptolemaic universe versus the Copernican model. Footnote: the Ptolemaic model held that the sun and planets revolve around the earth. It was replaced by the Copernican model, which holds that the earth and planets revolve around the sun. End of footnote. Like the Ptolemaic model, the evolutionary model is now proving quite cumbersome. Some members of this institute travel around to various universities. In the last year or two, they have held several debates before thousands of spectators at universities in Tennessee, Texas, etc. Interest has been quite high. Those defending evolution have not been able to give sound evidence in support of it, and in fact on several points were caught on their ignorance of recent discoveries in paleontology. There are very sophisticated and knowledgeable people defending both points of view. Here, we will not even discuss the question of atheistic evolution because it is obviously a philosophy of fools, of people who can believe, as Huxley said, that if you put a group of monkeys together with typewriters, they will eventually give you the Encyclopedia Britannica, given enough time, if not millions, then billions of years, according to the laws of chance. Someone calculated evolutionary theory according to the laws of chance and found that in fact such a thing would never happen. Anyone who can believe that can believe anything. The more serious dispute is between theistic evolution, that God created the world and then it evolved, and the Christian point of view. Here we must say that the fundamentalist point of view is incorrect in many instances because the fundamentalists do not know how to interpret Scripture. They say, for example, that the book of Genesis must be understood literally, and one cannot do this. The Holy Fathers tell us which parts are literal and which parts are not. The first misunderstanding that must be cleared away before even discussing this question is one that causes many people to miss the point, and that is that we must distinguish between evolution and variation. Variation is the process by which people make various hybrids of peas, different breeds of cats, etc. After 50 years of experimentation, for example, they came up with a new breed of cat, a combination of Siamese and Persian called the Himalayan cat, which has long hair like a Persian with the coloring of a Siamese. At first, this had happened accidentally, but the cat was never able to reproduce itself purely, and only now, after all these years of experimentation, have they come up with a new breed which breeds true. Likewise, there are different breeds of dogs, different varieties of plants, and the very races of men are all quite different. Pygmies, Hottentots, Chinese, Northern Europeans, all different types of human beings who came from one ancestor. Therefore, the question of variation is one thing and must be distinguished from evolution. Footnote. In his notes, Father Seraphim writes, "The popular mind accepts mere variation as proof of a much bigger question of evolution. We leave it to scientists to define the limits of change observable to them. By its grandiose conception, evolution as such cannot be proved by the small variations observable by science today. Let scientists define the limits of variation and let them use the word and concept of evolution in explaining change, but let them abandon metaphysical schemes which strive to extrapolate small changes into an all-encompassing principle. If this latter is true, let it come naturally from the data without forcing an interpretation on facts." End of footnote. There are undoubtedly many variations within one kind of creature, but these variations never produce anything new. They only produce a different variety of dog or cat or bean or people. In fact, this is more of a proof against evolution than for it, because no one has ever been able to come up with a new kind of creature. The different species, and this term is itself quite arbitrary, for the most part are not able to bear offspring with each other, and in the few cases where they can, the offspring is not able to reproduce itself. Thus, Saint Ambrose of Milan says, "This is an example to you, O man, to stop meddling in the ways of God. God means for each creature to be separate." 2. Historical background. During the period of the Enlightenment, the worldview was quite stable. Just before this time, the Anglican Archbishop Usher of Armagh calculated all the years given in the Old Testament genealogies and came up with the idea that the world was created in the year 4004 before Christ. Footnote. The Archbishop's finding was published in 1650 and was soon added as a marginal notation to the book of Genesis in the authorized version of the Bible. His calculation was based on the Masoretic Hebrew text of the Old Testament. According to the Old Testament chronology, in the Septuagint Greek text, which is used by Orthodox Christians, the Earth is approximately 1,500 years older than Archbishop Usher's calculation. End of footnote. Newton believed this, and the enlightened worldview was in favor of the idea that God created the world in 6 days and then left it to develop itself, and that all the species were just as we see them today. The scientists of that time accepted that. At the end of the period of enlightenment, however, as the revolutionary fever began to come on, this very stable worldview began to break down, and already some scientists were coming up with more radical theories. At the end of the 18th century, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, had already come up with the hypothesis that all of life comes from one primordial filament, which is exactly what is meant today by the theory of evolution. Footnote: Erasmus Darwin's book Zoonomia, in which he proposed this theory, was published in 1794. End of footnote. His theory did not concern only one species or kind of creature, but proposed that a primordial blob or filament developed into all the different kinds of creatures by transmutations. Would it be too bold, he asked, to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one filament? This new explanation of Erasmus Darwin was an attempt to continue the spirit of the Enlightenment as utter rationalism and simplicity. As rationalism entered deeper into the mind, it was simpler, he thought, to explain life as coming from a single living filament than to give the more complicated explanation that God gave being all at once to all different kinds of creatures. Footnote: the term Darwinism was first applied to Erasmus Darwin's theories about evolution, which included natural selection. These theories contributed much to the ideas of his grandson Charles, although the latter never acknowledged the depth. End of footnote. There was one naturalist, Chevalier de Lamarck, author of Philosophie zoologique, 1809, who had a definite evolutionary theory just after this, but he had the idea that the changes necessary to account for the evolving of one species into another were due to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This could never be proved, and has in fact been quite disproved. Hence, the idea of evolution did not take hold. There was, however, one important geologist at this period of the early 19th century who gave a great impetus towards the acceptance of this idea of evolution. This was Charles Lyell, who in 1830 came up with the theory of uniformitarianism, that is, that all we see in the earth today is due not to catastrophes, to a sudden flood or something similar, but rather to the fact that the processes operating today have been operating in past ages from the beginning of the world as far back as we can see. Therefore, if we look at the Grand Canyon, we see that the river has been eating away the canyon, and we can calculate by taking into account how fast the water flows, how much water there is in it now, the quality of the soil, and so on, how long it must have taken to wear away the canyon. Lyell thought that if we assume that these processes were always going on at the same rate, this being very rational and given to calculation, we can come up with a uniform explanation of things. In his book Principles of Geology, Lyell wrote, "No causes whatever have, from the earliest time to which we can look back to the present, ever acted but those now acting, and they have never acted with different degrees of energy from which they now exert." Of course, there is no proof of this. This is merely his hypothesis. Footnote: in 1831, a year after Lyell's Principles of Geology was published, Darwin read it during his voyage on the Beagle. After the voyage, Lyell became Darwin's mentor, and it is clear from Darwin's later statements that Lyell's ideas made him think of applying the principles of uniformitarianism to the past history of living creatures. In his private letters, Lyell made it clear that he was intent upon abolishing what he called mosaic geology, that is, interpreting the geologic strata in terms of the Genesis flood. Henry M. Morris writes, "It is worth noting that neither Darwin nor Lyell were trained as scientists in the modern sense. Darwin was an apostate divinity student whose only degree was in theology. Charles Lyell was trained as a lawyer, not as a geologist. The leading geologists of his day, Cuvier, Buckland, for example, believed in catastrophism, and many of the geologists of our own day are now returning to that view. Lyell must have known that the actual data of geology predominantly favored catastrophism, not uniformitarianism. Yet he dogmatically insisted on long ages and uniformity, sarcastically rejecting the biblical chronology in the process." Stephen Jay Gould, one of today's leading evolutionists, has actually accused Lyell of deception in his promotion of this system. Lyell relied upon true bites of cunning to establish his uniformitarian view as the only true geology. Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. End of footnote. This idea, together with the idea which was now gaining sympathy, that species evolve one into the other, led to another idea. If you put these two ideas together, you get the idea that most likely the world is not just a few thousand years old, like the Christians seem to say, but that it must be very many thousands or millions of years old, or even more. Thus arose the idea of the greater and greater age of the earth. But again, this belief that the world must be very old was only a presupposition. It was not proved. Already this idea was sinking into the minds of men when in 1859 Charles Darwin came out with his book propounding the idea of natural selection. Darwin's idea was opposed to that of Lamarck, who said that the giraffe evolved because a short-necked creature stretched its neck to eat the higher leaves. Its offspring had a neck an inch longer, the next one stretched a little more, and gradually it became what we know today as a giraffe. This is against all scientific laws because such things do not happen. An acquired characteristic cannot be inherited. For example, when Chinese women had their feet bound, their daughters were always born with normal feet. Darwin, on the other hand, came up with the idea that there were perhaps two longer-necked creatures which survived because they had longer necks. They were joined together because all the rest died off due to adverse circumstances or disaster, and their offspring did have longer necks because a change had occurred within them, what scientists today call a mutation. This might have been a chance thing at first, but once reproduction between two such creatures has taken place, it continues down through the ages. Of course, this is a guess because no one has observed such a thing happen. But this guess struck the consciousness of the people. They were like tinder, all ready for it, and this was the spark. The idea sounded so plausible, and the idea of evolution took hold, not because it was proved. As a matter of fact, the speculations of Darwin were based almost entirely upon his observations, not of evolution, but of variation. When he was traveling in the Galapagos Islands, Darwin wondered why there were 13 different varieties of one kind of finch, and thought that it was because there was one original variety which had developed according to its environment. This is not evolution, but variation. From this, he jumped to the conclusion that if you keep making small changes like that, eventually you will have an absolutely different kind of creature. The problem in trying to prove this scientifically is that no one has ever observed these larger changes. They have only observed changes within a kind. Footnote: this is because, as has now been shown through genetic research, the capacity for variation of a particular organism is limited by the inherent variability of that organism's gene pool. In other words, writes Philip E. Johnson, the reason that dogs don't become as big as elephants, much less change into elephants, is not that we just haven't been breeding them long enough. Dogs do not have the genetic capacity for that degree of change, and they stop getting bigger when the genetic limit is reached. End of footnote.